And I'd like to introduce Holland. Several years ago, we had a visit here in Louisville from Pakyaya Stakuth, who is the General Secretary. I'm sorry. He is the
General Secretary.
General
of the Nahdlatul
Secretary.
Ulama Supreme Council.
Thank you so much. And Holland, who is a close aide of Pakyaya. And we had an extraordinary afternoon together, and a friendship began, which has led me to learn more about the activities of the Nahdlatul Ulama in the area of what they call humanitarian Islam. So I think for anyone who's listening, it would be great to have a few words from you about the project that you've been involved in, the aims of humanitarian Islam, and a little bit about the Nahdlatul Ulama.
Okay, maybe I'll start with Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU for short. It's the world's largest Muslim organization. Demographically, it has approximately 40% of Indonesia's population self-identify with Nahdlatul Ulama, and there's over 270 million people living in Indonesia. So one can quickly do the math there. Nahdlatul Ulama was founded in 1926 by top Muslim scholars living in what was then the Dutch East Indies. A number of the people who founded NU had studied in Mecca, and they were aware that in 1925, a movement known to history as the Wahhabi movement, led by the Saud clan, returned to Mecca and Medina. They had conquered Mecca and Medina in the early 19th century, were driven out by the Ottoman Empire, but returned in 1925 and conquered what is today Saudi Arabia. And many of the traditional Muslim scholars who lived and taught in the Hijaz, in the Mecca and Medina region, obviously the heartland of the revelation, the Quranic revelation, were killed or otherwise silenced by the Wahhabis. And this was not lost on their disciples, who by that time had become senior scholars, ulama themselves, living in Java and other lands in the East Indies. And so they formed what was known as the Hijaz Committee, and sent that committee to meet with King Abdulaziz and request that the Saudis allow traditional Islam to be practiced and taught as before the conquest of Mecca and Medina. And when they were refused, they came back and reported to their colleagues and decided to establish the Nahdlatul Ulama because they were visionary, and we could say, 75 years before 9/11, they could already see the storm on the horizon, because they understood that every religion has different aspects. Islam, like Roman Catholicism, like Christianity, as we see with Buddhism and Hinduism today, in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, various manifestations. You have expressions of great wisdom and concern for one's fellow human beings, but you also have religion which can be weaponized for political power in this world. So Nahdlatul Ulama was founded in 1926 in direct response to the Wahhabi conquest of Mecca and Medina. At every key turning point in Indonesian history, whatever was decided, whenever the Nahdlatul Ulama whenever there's a crisis, Nahdlatul Ulama tends to become consolidated behind powerful leadership in the face of crisis. And at every key turning point in Indonesian history for the past, what is now 94 years, the direction of the Nahdlatul Ulama has determined the direction of Indonesia. Nahdlatul Ulama played a key role in establishing Indonesia as a multi-religious and pluralistic nation state in 1945. It was actually the Nahdlatul Ulama who led the violent conflict with the British and the Dutch after World War II, when the Dutch didn't have any troops to come to Indonesia and reoccupy their colony after the surrender of Japan, the British came first with the intent of handing Indonesia over to the Dutch, and the Nahdlatul Ulama refused to accept this. They reject colonialism. They defeated the Dutch in a 4-year war of independence. Then from 1949 to 1962, there was a 13-year armed guerrilla movement known as the Islamic State movement, Darul Islam. And there were people behaving just like ISIS in West Java, cutting off the heads of religious leaders from Nahdlatul Ulama and others who supported Indonesia as a multi-religious, pluralistic nation state. The extremists were killing members of the NU itself. But the Nahdlatul Ulama backed the Sukarno government and the Indonesian military in preserving what is known here as the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia and Pancasila, its founding pluralist ideology, which is based on a principle from old Javanese known as Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. It means basically oneness amid diversity. And people often translate that phrase. It's from the 14th century, a 14th century Javanese poem before the coming of Islam. Certainly before the widespread conversion to Islam in Java. And Bhinneka Tunggal Ika emerged at a time of Hindu-Buddhist rivalry, but also Hindu-Buddhist syncretism. Because what the phrase basically means, it relates to the idea within Sufism, within Islam, of wahdatul wujud, the unicity of being, which is certainly a very spiritual understanding, expression of the idea of Tawhid, as opposed to the Wahhabi idea of Tawhid. And the state motto of Indonesia became Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. And so Nahdlatul Ulama founded the Indonesian nation, modern Indonesian nation state, in 1965. From the 1950s and early 60s, the third largest communist party in the world was here in Indonesia. There was an attempted coup in 1965, which then led to widespread human rights violations, including by elements within Nahdlatul Ulama itself, because there was a kill or be killed dynamic that emerged within Indonesian society because of the intense conflict between communists and non-communists. As you probably know, the historical context of this and the Bolshevik Revolution, anybody who was religious was killed by the Bolsheviks. During Mao in China, we can see what happened to various religious expressions in China and what happened to Tibet to the current day, what's happening in China with the Uyghurs. And so there was a terrible situation that occurred in the 1960s. And this is part of the way that we deal with everything. You just have to be honest about history. It's an innate human tendency for people to want to weaponize history or weaponize identity in order to victimize other groups. You're asking about humanitarian Islam. I'm coming towards the future here, towards the present. After the crisis in the 1960s with those massacres, the Suharto regime was put in place. It lasted for 32 years. It was authoritarian. And a close friend of mine and of other spiritual leaders within Nahdlatul Ulama, a man named ar-Rahmah Wahid, whose grandfather was the first chairman of the Nahdlatul Ulama and one of the major founders of Nahdlatul Ulama, President Wahid, popularly known as Gustur, became the general chairman of Nahdlatul Ulama in 1984. And he used his position of power to once again consolidate the NU. And he did so to promote a vision of a civil society Islam, which ultimately played a key role in bringing down the Suharto dictatorship in 1998, led to democratic elections for the transition to functional democracy in Indonesia in 1999. President Wahid himself, we refer to him as President Wahid because he became the first democratically elected president of Indonesia in 1999. Some of the hallmarks of his time in office were restoring the military to civilian control, eliminating government control of the media, removing discriminatory laws, which were very severe against Chinese Indonesians, reinforcing the principles of the Indonesian constitution, which grant religious liberty to all Indonesians, and so forth. And the Nahdlatul Ulama, one of the consequences of democracy is that whereas Suharto had repressed radical Islam within Indonesia for a number of years, Suharto came from a Javanese nationalist tradition, which Suharto himself was a Muslim, but he was by no means a Wahhabi or a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or an Islamist. He came from this traditionally Javanese, pluralistic, and tolerant understanding of Islam for all his personal authoritarian tendencies. But with the coming of democracy, then whatever is in the society can reemerge and compete freely, free of repression. And this is one of the reasons that there's been a lot of chaos in Indonesia for the past 20 years. Terrorist attacks, bombings, and so forth cannot be separated from what's going on in the rest of the Islamic world or wherever Muslims live. And I'm obviously not picking on Islam or Muslims. I'm simply expressing Nahdlatul Ulama's objective, rational analysis of what happens in the world and what is happening in the world. And there are elements of classical Islamic orthodoxy and jurisprudence, which emerged 500, 1,000, 1,200 years ago within the context of endemic conflict within the Middle East, where the ideal of governance for Muslims was a caliphate led by a political imam, or caliph, a representative of God on earth, who would mobilize the Muslim male population to fight against infidels. So this is a classical element of Islamic orthodoxy, because Muslims who were fighting Christians, who were fighting Hindus, who were fighting people in Africa, black Africans who were not Muslim, they established a set of religious and legal norms to govern their conduct of warfare and their treatment of conquered peoples. These are the classical books of Islamic orthodoxy. And while these elements of Islamic orthodoxy certainly ensured the survival of Islam and of Muslims during the era of a conflict between kingdoms and empires throughout the world. You can think of the conflict between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire and so forth. In today's world, where we have people of every faith and ethnicity living side by side, these elements of Islamic orthodoxy, if drawn upon by groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which they do, lead to civil insurrection and conflict and violence between people who have not just adherents of different faiths, as we saw in Iraq with the massacre and enslavement of Yazidis and Christians, but between Muslims themselves, where Sunni Muslims may massacre and justify the massacre of Shiite Muslims, and Shiite Muslims, I'm talking about the government of Iran, basically moving for Shiite dominance in the Muslim world. And so the humanitarian Islam movement really is carrying forward a tradition that is over 500 years old in Java and in Indonesia. Indigenously here, I live in central Java, near the largest Buddhist monument in the world. And within Java, we refer to this as Islam Nusantara. Nusantara is a Javanese term which came into modern Indonesian, means the place between the islands. And Nusantara is the home, this is the Indonesian archipelago, it's the home to one of the great civilizations of the world, which was previously part of the Indianized cultural sphere. And Islam, when it became dominant within Java, actually adapted to the pre-existing culture and civilization of the Javanese and of Nusantara, and it constitutes one of the unique and valuable expressions of Islam. And it is referred to, as I say, within Indonesia, this is referred to as Islam Nusantara. It's an Islam which maintains the essential teachings of Islam, but then does not reject the culture and the civilization to which it came hundreds of years ago. And the humanitarian Islam movement was founded by the top spiritual leaders of Nahdlatul Ulama in order to deal with these issues that I'm referring to, which that they're very familiar with from 500 years history of Islam in Indonesia, and then communicate with both Muslims and non-Muslims worldwide in order to discuss and create a global movement which will facilitate the emergence from an Islamic perspective, fiqh al-hadara, a fiqh for the global civilization of the 21st century, in which Muslims do not become non-Muslim, non-Muslims do not inherently become Muslim, but rather where it establishes a legal basis within Islam, a fiqh basis, a jurisprudential basis for Muslims to live alongside non-Muslims in a harmonious way in accord with the realities of the 21st century. And the Humanitarian Islam movement simultaneously is establishing a close working relationship with various non-Muslim, both individuals and institutionally, to achieve the purpose of building a global civilization for the 21st century, founded upon the principle of respect for the equal rights and dignity of every human being.
Wonderful. Such a comprehensive description of the history and the current configuration of the Nahdlatul Ulama. And since I became aware of this movement, which was fairly early on in, I think, this new chapter of humanitarian Islam, I've been really impressed with the very methodical way that this movement has progressed. And there have been a few steps in this. I became familiar when the Declaration of Humanitarian Islam was formulated. And at the end of this, we'll recommend a site that somebody can go to actually view these documents and learn from them, because in fact, they form a kind of blueprint for this humanitarian Islam and a justification within Islamic fiqh, and also a recontextualization of Islamic law that is absolutely necessary for the conditions that we have in this world, that is where cultures, nations, religions are converging into a new state of interdependence. So, Holland, it might be great to just run through some of the stages of this recent movement, and particularly some of the recent news where the principles that have been laid out to recontextualize Islamic law and strategic thinking are now beginning to be applied to other religious contexts where we see also a dire need for this kind of recontextualization.
Right, I'd be happy to do so, Kabir. Maybe I'll run through historically. As I mentioned earlier, the people who are behind the Humanitarian Islam movement are top spiritual leaders within Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim organization. I'll mention a few names. The inspiration was Gustur, Abdurrahman Wahid, the former chairman of NU. In 2014, we established, President Wahid died in 2009, but he sort of set certain things in motion which have led to everything I will now describe, because the Humanitarian Islam movement is led by close friends and associates and disciples of President Wahid. In 2014, the then chairman of Nahdlatul Ulama, Kiai Haji Mustafa Bisri, he was the chairman of the Supreme Council, very close, the best friend of President Wahid, remains active to this day. Gus Mus, he's popularly known, he and another gentleman named Yahya Holil Stakov, whom you know, who's visited you in your home, popularly known as Gus Yahya, who's currently the General Secretary of Nahdlatul Ulama, and I and a friend from North Carolina, from the Haynes family, Haynes textile family, established something called Bait ar-Rahmah, Liya Da'wa al-Islamiyya Rahmatan lil Alamin. It's a mouthful, but for those who know Arabic or don't, it basically means the home of divine grace, or the home of universal love and compassion, the home of Rahmah, right? The key principle of Islam, what we regard as the primary message of Islam, that Islam should function as a source of universal love and compassion. So the name of the organization was Bait ar-Rahmah Liya Da'wa. Da'wa often is translated, literally means the call or the invitation. Maybe translate English as proselytism, but the call and the proselytism in question is what we refer to in Indonesia as Da'wa Wali Songo, the Da'wa of the 9 saints who were responsible for Islam coming to Java and spreading in Java in the 15th and 16th centuries. It's the Da'wa of the enlightened souls. It's the Da'wa of the saints. It's the Da'wa of example, not the Da'wa of the sword. And from their perspective, what is important is not that one rush and jump and join as an adherent of a formal religion, but rather that one attain a state of spiritual perfection. And from their perspective, you could be Muslim, you could be Sunni, you could be Shia, you could be Christian, you could be Jewish, you could be man, you could be a woman, you could be Hindu, you could be Buddhist. What's important is a heart that radiates light and love for all of creation, rather than arrogance which seeks to impose one's will on others. So Bait ar-Rahmah Liya Da'wa al-Islamiyya, which simply means Islam, Rahmatan lil Alamin, which is derived from the 21st surah, the 21st chapter of the Quran, the 107th verse, which says, I, God, sent you, Muhammad, to be nothing but Rahmatan lil Alamin, to be nothing but a source of universal love and compassion, to be nothing but that which nourishes every aspect of creation. As I said, Nahdlatul Ulama regards Rahmah as the primary message of Islam. And if something conflicts with Rahmah, you go into a crowded marketplace with a bomb and you blow people up. You attack a Christian seminary and you abduct and torture and kill people from that seminary. You go into a school and kidnap girls and turn them into sex slaves. There are people in the world today who are performing these actions in the name of Islam. And in fact, classical Islamic orthodoxy historically was predicated on endemic violence between Muslims and non-Muslims, because this was the sociological, cultural, political reality of the Muslim world for over 1,000 years, from the time of the revelation until the modern era. And so the Humanitarian Islam movement is not in the business of criticizing the old fiqh, the old elements of Islamic jurisprudence, but rather simply identifying those elements which emerged in a different time and place, identifying what has since changed, which would necessitate, as you put it, Kabir, what would necessitate new ijtihad, which would necessitate the emergence of new elements of the orthodoxy, which can facilitate Muslims and non-Muslims living together, faithful to their religion, but without undermining or killing or seeking to dominate one another in the 21st century. So from a practical point of view, this is a work which is being led by the spiritual, top spiritual figures within Nahdlatul Ulama. And they in turn established this organization, Bait ar-Rahmah, which is incorporated in North Carolina in the United States. It serves as an operational hub for the global expansion of Nahdlatul Ulama activities. And in 2016, Nahdlatul Ulama, because of the tremendous success of a campaign from 2014 to 2016, the Islam Nusantara campaign, which occurred at the time of ISIS, conquest of Mosul, the tremendous violence that was occurring in Syria and Iraq, defensive mechanism was put in place in Indonesia, Islam Nusantara campaign, created by and led by these top spiritual leaders, including Mustafa Bisri and Yahya Stockwolf. And then Nahdlatul Ulama in 2016 held what was known as an International Summit of Moderate Islamic Leaders. ulama, Muslim scholars from over 30 countries around the world attended. There were more than 700 Muslim scholars, ulama and fuqaha, or jurists, who attended this event in Jakarta. Nahdlatul Ulama issued what is known as the ISOMIL, Nahdlatul Ulama Declaration, simple, 16 points. But to show you the courage and the vision of these spiritual ulama, point number 8 of the Nahdlatul Ulama Declaration states that in the opinion of Nahdlatul Ulama, the primary cause for the spread of religious extremism and terrorism among Muslims is Muslims' own interpretation and understanding, or tafsir, of Islam. And subsequent point states that in the opinion of Nahdlatul Ulama, the primary factor driving Islamophobia in much of the world is the behavior of Muslims. This is not rocket science, although it may not be politically correct to say this in much of the West, but the Nahdlatul Ulama said it outright. I mean, people are coming into your home and attacking and killing you on the basis of a religion, then it naturally intimidates and terrifies people, because this is the vision of Islam that's constantly coming into the news and has been coming into the news for decades. It's not the da'wah of a noble example of the saints. It's the da'wah of the sword and of terrorism, which is very deliberate on the part of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so these are just different understandings and interpretations of Islam, and there's a conflict obviously going on within the Islamic world as to which understanding and practice of Islam shall become dominant in the 21st century. Now, with the authorization, because this Ismail Nahdlatul Ulama Declaration became official policy, the Nahdlatul Ulama Central Board, all 4 members, the elite top figures, signed this document, called upon people of goodwill of every faith and nation to join together in seeking to prevent the political weaponization of Islam. And the Nahdlatul Ulama committed itself to work to mobilize the global al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, the global Sunni Muslim community, to ensure that Islam and Muslims truly serve as a source of rahmah, a source of love and compassion for all humanity. So this was the first step, we could say, Kabir, in a systematic and institutional approach to address these issues. And the second step is what you were involved with in 2017. In March of 2017, acting upon this, so actually I should back up 1 second. The second, 2 days after the Ismail Nahdlatul Ulama Declaration was released at that event in Jakarta, the summit in Jakarta, the Nahdlatul Ulama Young Adults Movement, Gerakan Pemuda Ansur, they have 5 million members. They held the first Global Unity Forum in Jakarta and deliberated together with Christians, Buddhists, Confucianists, and others, including Egyptian Copt and various other figures, Hasidic Jew from the organization which Chabad Lubavitcher, you may know that during the attacks in Mumbai that were orchestrated by Pakistani intelligence and Lashkar-e-Taiba, where so many people were massacred in Mumbai in 2008, they took control of the Chabad house and viciously tortured a husband and wife who were Hasidic Jews at the Chabad house. A Hasidic Jew rabbi came to this first Global Unity Forum, and the Nahdlatul Ulama Young Adults Movement, Ansur, at the conclusion of that event, that forum, issued a public call that was structured according to the rules of fiqh and the rules, the principles of usul fiqh, the methodology used to create new Islamic law, calling for qualified ulama, qualified Muslim religious scholars, to examine and address those elements of fiqh, those elements of classical Islamic law, which lend themselves to being used to foster, to justify religious segregation, discrimination, and violence perpetrated towards those who are perceived to be non-Muslim. And that then set in motion structurally legally within the framework of Islamic jurisprudence, a basis for the event that you attended, Kabir, in Jombang, East Java, the birthplace of Nahdlatul Ulama. In March of 2017, Gerakan Pemuda Ansor and Bait ar-Rahmah launched the Humanitarian Islam movement because we realized that we cannot export Indonesian or Javanese culture. We cannot export to the world Islam Nusantara. Why would people want to adopt cultural or civilizational expressions from the historic East Indies or Malay archipelago? However, the principles of Islam Nusantara, how can the religion of Islam adapt itself within a pre-existing civilization so as to build civilization together and to enliven and enrich that civilization with the immense contributions that can come from Islam? This is the expertise of Islam Nusantara, but we created the framework of humanitarian Islam to set in movement a process whereby these principles could be conveyed, and this could occur on a global basis. Islam, as Yahya Stakov says, Islam which does not come to conquer or destroy, Islam which comes to build a civilization together. That is the purpose of humanitarian Islam. You were humble enough earlier not to mention your own vital role in the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam. And for those watching this video, the document, the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam, cites a number of Muslim authorities at the outset, starting with the Quran and the Sunnah, and then various top Muslim figures from history and today. And one of those is Sheikh Kabir Helminski, whose statement on Sharia is an integral part of the theological basis for the adoption of the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam. And Sheikh Kabir also helped draft that document and provided his wisdom and insight in the creation of the document, and then participated in the event in East Java where the predicate considerations were laid out prior to the adoption of the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam. And as you did mention, Kabir, the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam has two parts. The first part is laying out the problem rationally and simply and sincerely. The second part constitutes a roadmap, a five-part roadmap for the recontextualization. This is the term that Nahdlatul Ulama prefers to use. People in the West may not even immediately intuit what recontextualization means. In the West, we're more familiar with the idea of reform. Sometimes people in the West talk about the need for reform of Islam. Within the Nahdlatul Ulama, the term that we use is recontextualization, because the core principles and teachings and values of Islam need to be applied to the context of our current reality, which is different from the context of the reality in which the the Quranic revelation emerged, and the subsequent centuries and millennium when the classical jurisprudence or fiqh was established and assumed, you could say, very solid form, and basically has not been changed in the past 500 years. So the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam laid out a roadmap for the emergence of a new Islamic orthodoxy, which retains all the best elements of the past, its civilizational, spiritual depth and richness, but simply acknowledges and addresses certain obsolete tenets, which, if applied in today's world, will lead to unending conflict, as we see on display in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Libya and much of West Africa, and on the streets of Paris and Stockholm and Jakarta and Mumbai and New York. And so then from the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam, the next step, a year later, we convened a second Global Unity Forum in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and brought together key religious and political figures from a variety of traditions, not simply Muslim, issued the Nusantara Statement, which put into statement form the Nahdlatul Ulama's call for preventing the political weaponization of Islam, and combined that with the Gerakan Pemuda Ansor declarations call for the emergence of a new civilization founded upon respect for the equal rights and dignity of every human being. That's just a one-sentence statement, which key figures, religious and political figures from around the world signed. But that one statement is the final point out of a 176-point, 40-page document, which is written according to the classical principles of usul fiqh, laying out what changes have occurred in the past 5 centuries within the world, which necessitate the creation of new fiqh, which necessitate the performance of ijtihad and the recontextualization of certain obsolete and problematic Islamic tenets in order to prevent the types of problems that we see all around us and ensure that Muslims can live in peace and at peace with themselves and others, certain that we are good Muslims, but not having to follow the certain elements of fiqh, which, and then the question arises, and this gets us to the next point. What are those obsolete and problematic elements of fiqh or Islamic orthodoxy? One is, and these are what Sheikh Mustafa Bisri and Sheikh Yahya Stakov refer to as the areas of concern. One area of concern is a norm within Islamic law of enmity towards non-Muslims. And this is based on the concept, legal concept of kafir, of infidels. Now, we know that the Quran itself speaks of infidels, and at the time of the Quran, it specifically was referring to mushrikeen, or to polytheists in Mecca, who had persecuted the early Muslims. But in the emergence of classical Islamic orthodoxy in the centuries following the death of the Messenger of God, classical Islamic orthodoxy and Muslim armies and empires, which conquered the Persian Empire, conquered much of the pre-existing Byzantine Empire in the Levant and Egypt, North Africa, they had to have laws for governing people who were conquered. They had to have laws to rule their empire. And they created a series of laws emerged, and those laws have certain predicates. And one of the key elements herein, because of the sociological reality of the time, is that Muslims found themselves in armed conflict with non-Muslims on all sides. And there was no United Nations. There was no rules-based international order. There was no Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was just a question of kill or be killed. And what are you going to do when you conquer people? Are you going to kill them, or are you going to let them live in territory you've conquered? How do you treat them? And so there were certain laws that emerged and were codified, but those laws have carried forward into the present. I'll give you a very specific example in this context. And actually, I'll give you an example because I'll carry forward to one of the more recent developments, because after this Nusantara Manifesto was published and adopted by Bait ar-Rahmah and Gerakan Pemuda Ansor, it was also adopted by the Nahdlatul Ulama itself at what was known as, I'll say it in English, the National Conference of Nahdlatul Ulama Religious Scholars. 20,000 NU ulama and their disciples gathered in a town, in a pesantren or a madrasa in Banjar in West Java, and they considered all of these issues, these 4 areas of concern I mentioned earlier. I've only described one of them so far, the issue of what do you do with infidels? What is the status of infidels in a modern nation state? So these, the Nahdlatul Ulama at this MUNAS, the acronym in Indonesia, Musyawara Nasional Alim Ulama Nahdlatul Ulama, the National Conference of Nahdlatul Ulama Religious Scholars, or MUNAS, in 2019, studied and created new fiqh. They studied these issues and created new fiqh. The 4 specific areas of concern they examined and addressed: 1, what is the theological status of the modern nation state? Does it have theological legitimacy? Because in the classical fiqh, there were no nation states at the time, not only at the time of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also throughout the period of the caliphates and Islamic empires, there were no nation states. Nation states are a modern phenomenon. So there is no proviso or no basis for a modern nation state within classical fiqh, which is often conflated with Sharia, particularly by Islamist extremists. Sharia, we often, within Nahdlatul Ulama, refer to or use the term Sharia to refer to those eternal principles which lead one to God, although they also refer to those principles which in today's world will also help lead us to God if we follow them. But those which are of necessity, must be attuned to the context of our current lived reality, change over time. Those are the changeable elements of Islamic law and principles as opposed to unchanging elements. If we talk about an unchanging element, we have the issue of tawadu, or humility. We have the principle of shukr, or thankfulness. Thankfulness not only to God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, but thankfulness to fellow human beings through which God's blessings come to us, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, whether we perceive them to be Muslim or non-Muslim. So there are universal principles that all human beings who have a conscience that is alive share. These principles of noble purpose, of dignity, of respect for other human beings. But there are also those elements of Islamic law and orthodoxy which emerged at a particular place and time, which, if the circumstances change, those elements of fiqh need to change in order for the fiqh to be Sharia, in order for the fiqh really to lead us on the path to God. And so the Nahdlatul Ulama, at its Munas, its national conference in February of 2019, issued a ruling, ijtihad, that the modern nation state indeed is theologically legitimate in Islam. Ruled also that constitutions adopted by modern nation states are legitimate, and the laws adopted through modern political processes also legitimate and should be obeyed by Muslims, and if they deviate from Islamic teachings. And what Nahdlatul Ulama said at the Munas, it didn't say if they deviate from fiqh. It said if it deviates from Islamic teachings, if it deviates from core essential Islamic principles, then Muslims have an obligation to work through the constitution, through legal means in a modern nation state, to change these laws and bring them into alignment with Islamic values and principles, but cannot use this as a basis for armed insurrection and rebellion and killing people in order to impose their understanding and interpretation of Islamic principles on other human beings. And then another issue that was addressed at the Munas was this issue of the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. In classical Islamic law, or fiqh, there are four categories of kafir, there's four categories of infidel. One category is infidels whose rulers has a truce, not a permanent state of peace, because according to classical Islamic fiqh, there is no permanent state of peace with infidels, but there can be a truce. And if there's a truce, then non-Muslims who live ruled by a non-Muslim ruler who has a treaty with Muslims don't need to be killed. The second category, which is Muslims who are visiting an Islamic state, invited by or allowed by and under the protection of the caliph, of the Muslim ruler. And they have a safe conduct, and they fall into a second category of Islamic law. There's a third category of Islamic law known as kafir dhimmi, who are conquered Muslims, and they must live under certain restrictions, which in today's world, if one were to identify those restrictions, most people in today's world would be quite horrified by what those constraints were. But if we were to compare what those restraints are vis-a-vis what Jewish people or Muslims experienced in Europe and Christian kingdoms in the Middle Ages, we might find that they were very liberal compared to certain laws that were on the Christian side of the equation. But in today's world, are very problematic. And then the fourth category of infidel is known as kafir harbi, which means a kafir who doesn't fall into the previous three categories, is in a state of war with Muslims, and can be killed on sight. Those are the only four categories of kafir that exist within Islamic law. There's no other category. And so therefore, you can easily see where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are coming from when they behave the way they do, if they are seeking to operationalize those principles of classical Islamic law in the 21st century. So what the Nahdlatul Ulama did at the Munas was it issued a ruling stating that, it issued new ijtihad and created new fiqh, stating that there is no category of kafir within a modern nation state. The classical Islamic legal category, kafir, is no longer relevant, has no relevance, it has no validity in a modern nation state. In other words, every citizen of a modern nation state has equal rights, and there should not be Islamic supremacism vis-a-vis non-Muslims. And there should not be hatred or violence or a state of enmity between Muslims and non-Muslims, which leads us to the last principle that was adopted at the Munas, which was a statement that whenever there's conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims anywhere in the world, it's a religious obligation of Muslims to seek to act as mediators and to de-escalate the conflict rather than go and join in fighting against non-Muslims, as we see often justified on the basis of oppression of Rohingya Muslims by Buddhists in Myanmar, or what happened in Chechnya, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, basically, this feeds a narrative of violent jihad and of unending conflict between Muslims and infidels. And the basic premise of Nahdlatul Ulama is the world needs to be cooled. We need to find justice for parties on every side of a conflict, but we don't need, it's not the proper role for Muslims living in Indonesia or living in America or living in Europe to go to Syria and engage in a complex civil war in Syria. It's our job to seek to de-escalate conflicts and find peace.
And Holland, may I interject that in what you've been referring to as classical Islam, or classical Islamic fiqh, this is based in human formulations or human interpretations of what's in the Holy Quran, and are not necessarily intrinsic to essential Islam as we understand it.
Right, absolutely.
So we're not,
absolutely.
You're not changing what is there intrinsically in the divine revelation. It is more a critique of the human formulations that came subsequently.
Yeah, this is entirely right. So, for example, in the Holy Quran, you have a surah, Al-Kafirun, right? And there's no issue here of changing the text of the Quran. There's no issue here. And I think that you just made a very important point, Kabir, which is classical fiqh is based on ijtihad, which is the application of the human intellect to primary sources in order to create Islamic law. In other words, fiqh is the creation of humans. It's not the creation of God. But what you have with certain extremists is they always employ the term Sharia to describe fiqh. And they wish to create a confusion in the minds of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, so that people conflate and confuse what was created by human beings in the centuries after the Quranic revelation with the revelation itself and with the essential primary message of Islam itself. And so this is behind a lot of the problems that we have today, a failure to distinguish not only between fiqh and Sharia. Fiqh may sometimes be Sharia, right? But Sharia is by no means always fiqh. Or framed differently, fiqh is not always, they're not always the same. But what is unchanging, for example, from the perspective of humanitarian Islam, from the perspective of Islam Nusantara, the Nahdlatul Ulama, are the primary teachings and message of Islam and the Quranic revelation. These do not change.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful. And also during the period we're talking about when the so-called classical fiqh was established, it was a time when not only in the Islamic world, but in the whole world of empires, of clashing empires, as kill and be killed, conquer or be conquered, was the state of humanity at that time, with the exception perhaps of a few minor tribes here and there. But this is the world, humanity, this has been the human world for a long time, and now we've entered hopefully a period of universal human rights and more of a live and let live civilization. And,
right.
Yeah.
Now, on that point, when we held our second Global Unity Forum, I mentioned that there were prominent figures, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, who attended. One of those was from what's known as Centrist Democrat International. It's the largest political network in the world. In Europe, their affiliate is the European People's Party, the largest political network in Europe. Centrist Democrat International, its prior name was Christian Democrat International. You know, one of their prominent member parties that many people are probably familiar with is the Christian Democrat Union in Germany. Right? Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany's political party. Interestingly enough, after World War II and the horrors of World War II, Christian democracy and Western humanism, including Jewish humanism, Christian humanism, and Western humanism, played a key role in the emergence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Christian democracy played a vital role in the emergence of this and of the European Union. If we think about what came before the European Union, for all the European Union's flaws, if we look at the condition of Europe for 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years before the emergence of the European Union, certainly the situation now is preferable to what it was then. And so Centrist Democrat International, becoming aware of the Humanitarian Islam movement, asked us to recommend an Indonesian political party to join CDI. And through CDI, have political connections with the largest political network in Europe associated with EPP. And we recommended, and when I say we, it's Yahya Hulustakoff and Mustafa Bisri, recommended a party that's known as the National Awakening Party, which is rooted in the spiritual wing of Nahdlatul Ulama, which was founded, among others, by Abdurrahman Wahid, the former President Wahid and former chairman of Nahdlatul Ulama, and his close friend Mustafa Bisri, the co-founder of Bait ar-Rahmah and leader of the Humanitarian Islam movement. So PKB then took up the Humanitarian Islam agenda to bring it worldwide through its engagement with CDI. And since last year, CDI's executive committee has unanimously adopted 3 separate resolutions submitted by PKB. The first, unanimously endorsing the foundational texts of the Humanitarian Islam movement, which I've just described to you. The second, acknowledged that Western humanism and Christian democracy and Humanitarian Islam are kindred traditions, which share a common concern for humanity and believe that all human beings have a right, should have equal rights and respect in front of the law. And then a third resolution was adopted just last January, just before the coronavirus closed the door on international travel. The executive committee and many figures from Centrist Democrat International came to Indonesia, to Yogyakarta, and adopted a third resolution calling for basically laying a foundation for this part of the world, what we could call, from our perspective, part of what we're doing, basically creating an alternate pole of support for a rules-based international order founded upon universal ethics and humanitarian values. Again, this third resolution was unanimously adopted by Centrist Democrat International. So it's laying a foundation for political engagement, right? Actual political engagement, in where there's a ruling party, then there can be engagement with the ruling party, the government, namely the government. When they're not a ruling party, engagement which could lead to policy implementations when a party becomes the dominant party, because everything's like a wheel in this world. No political party rules forever in any country. But to give you an example of the types of dynamics associated with this, there's a country in West Africa that just a few months ago is dealing with an issue of changing its constitution, modifying its constitution. And the question arose because there were certain extremists who wanted to put in provisions that would allow for the imposition of certain elements of classical Islamic law, which might be problematic under the guise of being Sharia. And so there was a triangulation. And to give you another example of the types of engagement relationships that are being established, there's an organization known as the World Evangelical Alliance. It's the largest Protestant body in the world. Their affiliate members in countries around, over 100 countries around the world, have about 600 million members. And key leaders of the WEA, the World Evangelical Alliance, read the Declaration on Humanitarian Islam that you introduced, Kabir. In fact, one of their figures read that document 5 times, academically, theologically, studied it very closely, and approached us. And we've established a Humanitarian Islam World Evangelical Alliance joint working group in order to move forward together to build a global movement for cooperation to foster the emergence in the 21st century of a global civilization founded upon respect for the equal rights and dignity of every human being. They brought to our attention this issue with the Constitution in a West African country, and then asked that we provide advice and input, because the majority of the population in that country is Muslim, and the majority of the population is not only Muslim, but moderate Muslim. But then what often happens is you have extremists demanding changes and want to drive everything to a level of confrontation and dominance of their ideological view of Islam, their political view of Islam. And so through our cooperation with the WEA, and actually facilitated by the United Nations and the German Foreign Ministry, there was very successful engagement and dialogue involving Catholics, Anglicans, evangelicals, and Muslims, and the existing political party and government, Muslim political party and government in that country, to address this issue. And so this is also, the ideas of humanitarian Islam are very practical, the way we're trying to move forward, because this world is run by governments, and governments are controlled by politicians. And what we seek to do, our agenda is to foster foster the spread of what we know to be the deepest and true teachings of Islam, which is that the purpose of religion is to serve as a source of Rahmah, a source of universal love and compassion. And any time you have people acting in the name of God or acting in the name of religion, where it's not a source, a blessing for humanity, then there's obviously something wrong. And what's wrong there, as you pointed out, it's not the religion that's wrong. It's the way human beings are interpreting and acting upon their interpretation of the religion. And in fact, in that context, we do not belong to a tradition which performs takfir. In other words, we do not believe in saying you're not a Muslim. This is what extremists do as a prelude to killing other Muslims. You have Wahhabis, you have ISIS, you have Al-Qaeda and others performing takfir before they kill a fellow Muslim. From our perspective, you shouldn't be killing Muslims or non-Muslims, and you shouldn't perform takfir. However, the truth of the matter is that Islam is such a deep religion that those who have a shallow understanding of Islam, in many ways, are still acting along with the principles of Jahiliyyah, that is, the principles of spiritual ignorance that were characteristic of the Arab world at the time of the revelation itself. There's no reason to assume that somebody who is a Christian is acting upon the deepest, truest principles of Christianity, nor is there any reason to assume that somebody who's Buddhist is doing the same, or Hindu, or Jewish, or Muslim. So it's very important from our perspective that all of us engage in self-reflection, right? That we're not quick to blame other human beings, but we are engaged in a constant process of self-reflection and self-correction so that we can bring our own behavior into alignment with that which is most true and noble in our faith.
Well, Holland, that was a really comprehensive, informative, deep, and beautiful presentation of this movement for humanitarian Islam. And there's a lot to be digested here, especially for somebody coming to this subject for the first time. And I trust that this conversation will be of service to a wide community And I know there's more that we could talk about. I know there are further developments, but we will save those for another conversation when we may go even deeper into this subject.
Well, it's always good to see you, Kabir. And, you know, the spiritual leadership of Nahdlatul Ulama has the deepest respect for you. And also, I think it's fair to say, the deepest love for you and for Camille. And so just know that we thank you for everything you're doing and your deep concern for humanity.
Well, the feeling is entirely mutual. And, you know, I see what you all are doing as an ideal that can inspire a large portion of humanity, Muslims and non-Muslims. And as we know, it is spreading to so-called Christian Democrats, and it's going to spread to other religious traditions as well. And as I saw the beginnings of this movement, I was hopeful, but as we have followed it since, that hope has proven true, and it's one of the most encouraging phenomena that I can think of in this contemporary world. So I know you played a big part in it, and you articulated all so well. And I'm just really grateful to be even a tiny part of this. So thank you for your support, friendship, and your service in this humanitarian cause. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kabir. Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.